Expanding Mind with Erik Davis, Thursdays at 2 p.m. on the Progressive Radio Network.
Welcome, folks, to another edition of Expanding Mind. And today we're going to be talking about shamanism and Kabbalah. You know, we often have the opportunity to talk about Kabbalah or to talk about shamanism on this show. It's quite a topic these days. There is a growing emphasis. I have another problem with this. Growing emphasis on shamanism inside the academy as well. There is a kind of sense that within the shamanic framework there's a way to talk about other kinds of issues outside of South America or outside of Siberia, because of course shamanism itself is a academic construct. It's a way of talking about very different practices across the globe. And so with our guest today, we're going to be talking about the relationship of shamanism and Kabbalah. Professor Jonathan Garb is a longtime student of these matters. He is an associate professor of Jewish thought at Hebrew University, and he's spending the year in New York City. Lucky him. But before we bring on Jonathan, I want to talk to our lovely co-host, Maja Daou. Maja, how are you doing?
I'm good, Erik. How are you doing?
Pretty good. I guess I was having a little sound issue there again. Is it better?
Yeah, it's much better now.
Very weird. Very weird. I have these little gremlins that are lurking on my machine. I think it's. We may have to do some banishings or something. You got to help me with that. You're the White Witch, so maybe cook something up at the break. But I understand you have some interest in this matter as well. I mean, we'll be talking to Jonathan, but you've spent some time studying your Kabbalah. I
have. I mean, I got really deeply into it. I lived with an Hasidic Jew and basically read all of his books. I mean, I read the Mamloez. I've read, the Torah. One of my favorite books is Louis Ginsberg's Legends of the Jews. So I get really into Jewish folklore and kind of the impetus that Kabbalah sprung out of with alchemy and, folk magic and stuff like that, and how it seriously relates back to shamanism, not only in Judaism, but all throughout Europe, basically. A lot of the magic that we know today, like Golden Dawn and stuff like that, all originates out of those Kabbalistic shamanic traditions.
Yeah, well, we're just getting started. So let's bring on Professor Garb. Thanks for being with us here on Expanding Mind.
Hi, good afternoon.
Well, this is great. Well, I always like to start out the show with the interview asking about how folks find themselves interested in their topic of study. Were you always drawn to Kabbalism and mysticism in your study of Jewish thought, or was it something that emerged as you were going along with your studies?
Well, let's separate between Kabbalah and shamanism. It's two different stories in a way. Both started more or less at the same time. Since about the age of 15, I started to get interested in Kabbalah, in Jewish mysticism. That is, until then I had a relatively standard religious education in Jerusalem, and I was studying the normative texts, which most people at that time, we're speaking about almost 30 years back, most people were studying. And at around the age of 15 or 16, I started to get interested more in the mystical tradition. So that's one story. Now, around the age of, I can't remember, I guess it was about 23, so we're speaking in the early 90s, I read a book by James Hillman, who you might know, and he mentioned Eliade's book about shamanism, and it really interested me, but I sort of shelved it. And then 3 years later, I met a real shaman. So that's the second story.
Oh, okay. So it definitely proceeded on your own it grew out of your own interest in these things. And it sounds like you were already reading widely, beyond the Jewish tradition in terms of coming up with inspiration, whether it was James Hillman, whether it was meeting shamans. When did you start to feel like that there's going to be a real connection between these two kind of categories, which in a lot of ways, in a lot of people's heads, are fairly different, at least on the surface?
Yes. Well, it's interesting. I think when I met my shamanic friend, Dan Russell of England, so when I actually got exposed to the world of shamanic trance, not just shamanism in general, but specifically the idea of trance or sort of hypnotic states taken to a more meditative level than in, let's say, medical hypnosis. At that stage, I had to ring a bell, and I started to see lots of resonance with the experiences and concepts which I knew from the Kabbalistic world. So I think it was around that point we're speaking about, again, the early 90s, mid-90s.
So what was your encounter with this fellow like? Was it just someone you met casually, or what kind of shaman was this person?
Well, he actually, again, this is something which is a somewhat different track from my academic training, but again, this is what personally got me interested in it. Then he runs a center for hypnosis and a training center for hypnosis in North England. But his background, actually, besides being in the Jewish world, in a traditional Jewish world, was very much in Tibetan Buddhism and Taoism. And he, for many years, few decades, he actually collected or experienced shamanic techniques from around the globe in a way. So through a personal communication with him and through on an experiential level, I would say, got interested in the whole world of trance and hypnosis and how it relates to shamanism and meditation. And again, my training in the Jewish world was largely with texts, largely academic. I studied in the traditional Jewish academies in yeshiva, and afterwards I went to the university and studied at Hebrew University and did all my degrees there in Kabbalah. So for me, I did encounter some Kabbalists, but I think this was the first time that I had really had any kind of experiential contact with this material on a deep level. And this sort of, I would say, fed back into my academic interest at later stages.
Well, let's just talk, maybe set the stage a little bit by talking about the strain or the period of Kabbalah that you really work on academically. I mean, I think people who have a sort of casual knowledge or even, who have, read their share of books, often we hear a lot about medieval Kabbalah. We hear, we hear about Isaac Luria. But you study some Kabbalists and some Hasidic traditions that are a little bit later, more deeply in the modern period. So maybe tell us a little bit about the kind of the zone of Kabbalah that you really work on as a scholar.
That's a good idea, because I think that one of the things I'm trying to say in this book on Modern Kabbalah and Trance is that it's basically two things. And first of them is, just as you were saying, the focus, not just in the university, but also in popular versions of Kabbalah, is basically on the Zohar, which is a book which was composed in the Middle Ages in Spain, and on the Isaac Luria you mentioned, who wrote in Palestine, Israel, in the 16th century, so in the Galilee. So, and later periods have been somewhat neglected. Hasidism aroused a lot of interest. There's a lot of people in America actually who wrote quite a bit about Hasidism on a more popular level, Heschel and Elie Wiesel and so on. So Hasidism was one sort of enclave of interest, but actually the founder of Kabbalah studies in Israel, Gershom Scholem, he called Hasidism the last phase. So according to his description, basically somewhere in the 18th, 19th century, the story of Jewish mysticism ended. And what has been found, not just by myself, but other scholars the last decade or so, is that the story is very much going on. And so it went on in the 18th and 19th century and the 20th century, which I wrote a book about, and also the 21st century. And not just in the Hasidic world, but in other Jewish worlds as well. So really Kabbalah is live and well as a popular phenomenon, as in an academic field, and also as a mystical domain. And what's interesting is the last 10 years or so, again, I've been doing quite a bit of field work, I would say, in the Kabbalistic circles in Jerusalem. And what I saw there, especially in Hasidic circles, but not just, is that there are quite a lot of people who are interested in trance. And who are actually interested in hearing about trance in other traditions, even though in a very guarded kind of way.
Well, I think a lot of people forget that the Jewish meditation is, I mean, if anyone has ever seen anyone daven, like that was one of the things that really opened my eyes to it, was watching the davening, because they literally start rocking back and forth, and it's very kind of mantra-based, and you can watch them go directly into a trance. And I think a lot of people don't really witness that aspect of Judaism. Was that kind of like what brought you into it? Did you start doing davening?
Well, of course, I've been exposed to davening or to prayer from a very early age. Now, the interesting thing is that you're entirely correct about that there is a trance aspect in the prayer. For instance, there's a description from 2,000 years ago of a great sage, Rabbi Akiva, and it said that when he started the prayer, his prayers, when he would pray in public, he would pray like everybody else, but when he would pray in private, he would start in one side of the room and finish off in another side of the room. So it was something really wild, really ecstatic, sort of like the Shakers or something like that, if you can think of it in the American context, or Quakers. And I think that the more public version, that is praying like everybody else, is the one which took over generations. So it's true that people do rock in prayer. And which is interesting, there is a sort of auto-hypnotic thing about the shockling, the shaking, not the shaking, the rocking.
Right.
However, I think for most people it's almost like a habit. It's just, this is what people do when they pray. In Hasidic circles you can see something more interesting. I think you can see people who are really, not just in the rocking, but it could be in shouting, it could be in screaming even in some circles. People do get into wilder states, and one can observe that if one goes into certain Hasidic places which academics usually don't go to, even though they're only 10 minutes away from Hebrew University. So I think that I actually came to all this in a way, to Kabbalah and then to shamanism, through a certain disappointment with the form that public worship has taken. That is, my impression is, and I don't generalize, that for many years public worship and spiritual experience were not things that people related so easily. And I know that in Israel there's now a lot of interest in changing this, and in America through the Chabura movement and so on, but it's still something, there's a long way to go in these terms. So I'm really glad you brought up this whole question of prayer, because it is a very central Jewish practice, like in other religions as well, and I think it is related to trance.
Yeah,
well, let's talk a little bit about trance, because when you use it, especially in your book, you're very careful on how you use it, because it's one of those words that it leaks, it means different things in different places, and you really want to kind of focus in and say, what it is, what we can learn from anthropology, what we can learn from actual hypnosis. So why don't you give us a sense of what you mean by trance?
Well, I would say that the normal daily experience we've basically got 4 states of consciousness which everybody experiences. One of them is which is psychology is very interested in, is of course the dream state. There's actually a very interesting book come out now on Dreams and Kabbalah by Elliot Wolfson here from New York. So this is certainly one area which is really fascinating. And then there's deep sleep, which we don't know much about, because that's a state where nothing seems to happen on surface level, even though it's probably the deepest of all states that we experience. And then there's our ordinary waking consciousness, that our mind sort of goes around from one thing to another, what the Buddhists call, I guess, monkey mind. It sort of jumps from one thing to another during the day. Sort of internal chatter going on all the time, in a way, together with external chatter, which often goes on. And then there's trance. Now, trance, I think, is the least explored of all these 4, or the least obviously familiar. But when one looks at children, and there's a lot of work on this being done in hypnosis, especially by perhaps the greatest hypnotist in North America, maybe the greatest hypnotist of all time, is Milton Erickson of Arizona. And I was thinking of Texas, obviously because of Rice and because of Erik. But not far. So Milton Erickson, he really did a lot of work on what's called natural trance states. And his assumption is that you don't need to put somebody into a special state like many hypnotists do. There is a natural trance state that we all experience, and children experience it very often. And you can look at children playing or daydreaming and you can see it. But as adults, there are societal forces or even political forces which are pushing us away from it. So people only come to experience it about once in, let's say, 90 minutes or so.
So it's an ordinary state in a way,
yes.
But that one that can be like you can move into another state through it.
Exactly. I mean, it was a nice image that Dan once used. He said, Dan Russell, the shaman, he once said, it's like walking past rooms. You walk in a corridor just like I've got near my office here at NYU, and you walk and there's many doors, and you can decide to go into them or not. And usually people don't go into this door of trance because there's other doors which are in some way more compelling, or society wants them to be more compelling. But this door is open to us. That is, once in 90 minutes or so, on average, people find themselves sort of daydreaming, find themselves sort of lost in thought, as if they've been somewhere else. It could be while driving or doing some kind of routine activity. It could be... And of course, people who have gone into, I would say, the internal arts and done things like yoga or Tai Chi or meditation know more about these states in a way, because it's more legitimate to experience them.
Well, it's true, and there is this kind of feeling in the general public that to get into a trance, you have to, like, do drugs, or there's only specific things that will trigger it, when in fact, when you go into the shamanic tradition, certain movements will trigger it, certain sounds, certain light. Like, there's so many, like you said, there's so many kind of avenues that get there, and people just think when you say trance and shaman that you have to take a bunch of drugs. And I mean, to me, that was another, it's interesting that you mentioned Tai Chi and some of the Eastern traditions, and how you met your friend that was more into Taoism and Buddhism. Because one of the things I noticed with when I saw the like extreme trance states, which, like you said, were only with the Hasids, that were kind of, you know, in private and not in public, that would get into their states, they would always be wearing their tefillin. And my friend and I had like researched the tefillin a little bit, and we noticed that they fell on certain acupuncture points that would kind of be used for triggers. So I was curious if you found, like, through doing Tai Chi and some of these Eastern traditions to enter trance, did you see crossover that any of the Kabbalists would use? Did you see any kind of, like, communication between the two?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, first of all, to start with the whole question of what you started out with, is that it's true that many people associate trance with psychedelics. And of course, psychedelics can bring people into trance. I think Erik mentioned ayahuasca. However, it's certainly not the only way, and I'm not even sure if it's the best way. Even Carlos Castaneda, who really popularized this shamanic sort of Mesoamerican shamanism, at one point his imaginary teacher, Don Juan, says that drugs are for beginners, or even put it more strongly than that. And I think that one of the big obstacles people have with learning trance is that they think it's a special state, rather than just a movement of the mind, that one can decide, just use one's intention to go into trance. And this art of intention is indeed taught in places like Tai Chi or Raja Yoga or similar disciplines, how to use the intention, which is another thing that people are not used to in our culture, even though some psychologists have explored it. And what you mentioned about the Hasidim and the crossover and the tefillin is very interesting. I mean, I've seen a study about tefillin and acupuncture meridians and channels and points. On the way, there's so many points, there's about 360 official points, and they're always finding new ones, so it's very hard not to hit a point around the head.
Right.
But it does seem to fall along what we call the special meridians, of 8 extra meridians, or sort of deeper layers of the energy body in Chinese medicine. So it's intriguing. I wouldn't bank on that too much. It's certainly tefillin, and it's actually something which I wrote about in a book. It's something which is every traditional male, today even a few females, but traditionally male Jews from the age of 13 or so start putting on a tefillin every day, the boxes on the head and arm. And for many Kabbalists and Hasidim, this is indeed a trance state. I mean, I remember seeing Hasidic Rebbe, it was very interesting. When he put on the tefillin, he went so deep into trance, he just lost his motor control. He could hardly go on winding him around his arm. And this was just a very regular thing for him.
Yeah, they seem to have some kind of trigger for them, whether that's mental or physical, but it definitely seems to be part of the trance state for them.
I think so. I think the sin of a trigger is very interesting, because even though trance is a natural state, one can bring it more under one's control. It's not just something one has to wait for to happen every 90 minutes or whatever, or to wait for these doors to sort of appear. The interesting thing is triggers, and this is one of the things that Erickson and others have worked on a lot, is that one can anchor a trance state. That is, one can set up a certain object or state or word or mantra, as you mentioned, as a trigger, and then each time one uses this trigger, then one can deepen the trance state or return to it or enhance it. And I think many people, things like tefillin and the talit, that people sort of cover themselves with a prayer shawl and sort of go inside, these are indeed anchors and triggers, and this has somehow been missed in academic study of these issues.
Yes, you could even imagine that a lot of the rituals and just very simple practices that religious and even non-religious people have in terms of icons, in terms of gestures, in terms of doing certain habits the same way, are subtly involved with minor shifts in consciousness that allow a sort of deeper experience, or that can occasionally lead to a more profound otherworldly state. I think part of the problem that we have with the word trance is that we think of it as like a kind of not just passive but sort of like submerged quality. And there is passivity and there is submergence. I mean, you talk about in your book, one of the more fascinating parts for me was when you were talking about not so much the ascent of the mystics, which you can see, clearly in a broad shamanic context as climbing the ladder into the worlds, but also the descent part. So there is definitely a submergence going on there. But there's a liveliness and activity, a intelligence to trance that the term trance, at least as it's popularly used, kind of misses.
I think you're very right on that. I mean, it's one of the things that, indeed, as you say, I try to convey in a book, that on one level, one can go into very passive states, and what in yoga you call shavasana, the body becomes like a corpse, and it seems that nothing's happening, and just kind of, again, it can go into deep sleep in a way. And then there's also this energy, and the Hasidim had actually two different terms for this energy. One is what they called chiyus, which comes from a Hebrew word, which is vitality, and other is we spoke about bren, we spoke about fire or burning. And part of what I was trying to show in the book is that there's a lot of fiery element in trance, in Hasidic trance and other forms of trance. So there's a lot of energy moving around, a lot of vitality, a lot of wildness sometimes. And of course, this is one of the reasons why society is actually scared of both, in a way, because people are scared of people becoming too passive, because then they sort of drop out of the consuming producing machine, the matrix, so to speak, and also they're afraid of a wildness, and what the Buddhists called, actually Dan's teacher, his Buddhist teacher, called it crazy wisdom.
Yeah, so what else, like, what did the category of trance, whether you're thinking about it in terms of hypnosis or Ericksonian materials or maybe more anthropological thing, what did it help you see in a way differently than maybe earlier studies of Jewish mysticism have seen? Like, what's revealed partly by thinking in these terms?
Well, yeah, I don't want to knock, of course, earlier scholarship and the scholarship of other people working today. I mean, but there is an interesting expression in the Talmud that says there's no study hall, there's no Bet Midrash without innovation. So, of course, I do believe that I've got some kind of innovation here. And what I saw, which perhaps had been overlooked a bit, is two things. One is that people are not accustomed to associating the modern with shamanic, because shamanism, as you said, is, people think it's related maybe to all kinds of tribal societies that people used to even call primitive ones, and today, of course, we know better, archaic cultures, and as you say, Siberia or South America or Australia and so on, places like that. And maybe people would say, okay, maybe also there was witchcraft in Europe, which was stamped out in the 17th century, but once the modern period got going, people are not used to looking for this kind of phenomena. And there's actually a very strong scholarly bias, which I can go into maybe why it came about, that in the Hasidic movement there's been sort of a decline and a withdrawal from mysticism, and that's why Sholem called it the last phase, as if it's something that's ended. And I think empirically, if one just goes into the field and actually observes Hasidic people rather than just write about them, one can see that it's not the case and I don't think it was the case 100 years ago either. And if one goes into the text, one begins to uncover that in the modern world, shamanism and so-called archaic states are very much alive. And the reason why, I think, is connected perhaps also to the fact that if trance is a natural resource, then it's something which is accessible at all times and in different cultural contexts. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is that to really get into the details of it, that people can speak generally about mystical experience and so on, and that's a lot of work has been done. However, to actually explore how do people exactly go into trance, what are the triggers, what are the layers, what are the levels they go through, just as one would do in the hypnotic setting, just like in modern hypnosis. And I think once one starts taking this possibility seriously, that we're not just speaking about turns of phrase or literary devices, but there are actual techniques or experiences, then one can actually gain much more information about the details. And there's this expression that God is in the details, and the devil is also in the details. So I think that religious experience is in the details, and one has to really start exploring it in a much more detailed way.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful point. It also raises an interesting kind of a problem and a partial solution in terms of how we compare different traditions. Because, on the one hand, you could look at, some popular discourse around shamanism and, just, applying it to, any number of different phenomena, including, modern Westerners who are just, going out on their psychedelic journeys or whatever. And so it becomes this kind of too easy metaphor that drifts. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you can go too far in the other direction and say, look, if you're going to talk about, Jewish mysticism, you have to talk about it in Jewish terms, in terms of Jewish history, in terms of the specific practices that go between, through traditions. And if you start to compare like that, it's too much, it's too metaphoric. It doesn't actually tell you anything. But by introducing this sort of practical, but still in some sense, I won't say scientific, but the sort of regulatory aspect of these experiences that they happen because we have consciousness, because our minds work the way they do, that you can find a way to suggest comparisons that have real roots.
I think that this is really one of the issues, thorny issues, that is really, in a way, there's been a juncture which has in a way held up the study of mysticism, and people have opted for either extreme, that is either to say that mysticism is just this global phenomena and therefore cultural context has no meaning, and we don't have to really say what's unique about the Hasidic context, for instance, or the Jewish context or the Buddhist context. And the other extreme is to say that it's all just atomized and that you can't compare anything to anything, and it's all just a result of culture, which is sort of more of a postmodern kind of direction. And of course, a lot of scholars today are beginning to feel that there is a golden mean. Actually, of course, Jeff Kripal's work in Rice about it, and other people. And there is a middle way between these two paths, these two extremes. And I think that you're right, that the middle way really, in some way, is connected to a practice. That once one starts speaking about techniques and experiences and ways of life, really, not just techniques, but in a broader sense, how people actually go about their life in these ways, then things change, our perspective changes at that level. That is to say, what I noticed was interesting is that when you start speaking, let's say, to people in the Hasidic world about the Far Eastern ideas, so as long as one remains on the level of talking about ideas, then one doesn't get anywhere. But once one starts speaking about practices, they say, okay, yeah, sure, we know this. I mean, this is what we do, and so on. So I think that once one takes things in a very concrete and embodied kind of way and speaks about what's actually going on in a body during these states, at that level things start to come together, because the body is something which, with all that we know, that how socially constructed our bodies are, but there is something natural about the body. I mean, we all breathe, and if one goes deeper into the breath, one can go deeper in the mind as well, and these are things which are universal in a way.
That's great stuff. Well, we got to take a break now. This is Erik Davis. We're talking with Professor Jonathan Garb, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Welcome back to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. This is Maja Daou, and I'm here with Erik Davis. We're speaking with Jonathan Garb on Kabbalah and shamanism. And before the break, Jonathan, you were mentioning a little bit about practices. And this is, I know a lot of people, when you say shamanism, a lot of people are like, well, what does that word mean? And we've talked about trance, but one of the things that's always fascinated me is the actual shamanic practices that get included in Jewish mysticism. And you had mentioned briefly the Mircea Eliade book, The Forge and the Crucible, which I love that book and most of his work. And I came to a lot of Jewish mysticism studies through alchemy. And, of course, those go back to Egypt, which, I mean, in Judaism, that's like, Moses. So, but what I found was through researching a lot of this stuff with my Hasidic friend, you'll see the connection comes between healing, and of course there's some of the psychopomp stuff too, but two of the main sort of shamanic practices are healing and then the psychopomp. And you can see like Rambam or Moses Maimonides, who also spent a good deal of time in Egypt, right? He becomes this, healer and a doctor. And when most people think of a Jew, what do you think of, a doctor or a lawyer? That's like the stereotype. So what did you find in the actual like shamanic practices besides trance? Like how would you relate that through some of the Kabbalistic findings, like things they actually do or put into practice?
Well, this is very interesting because what you mention is we've got on the one hand the medical world, and the Jews have had a long-term relationship with the medical world, which didn't actually start out so harmoniously. I mean, in the Talmud, there's a bit of ambivalence about medicine. And actually one of the great medieval mystics, Nachmanides, he said, what does the true worshipper of God need to consult with doctors for? That is, if one really connected to God, then God is one's healer. So, I mean, medicine is just a concession, really, for those who are not on a high level. And then, of course, you mentioned Maimonides. That, of course, was indeed a very strong medical figure. And the last few years of his life, he didn't write anything about Jewish issues, only about medicine. And he was really part of a wider profession, together with his Muslim colleagues, as you say, in Cairo, or today Cairo. And so I think there is this connection to medicine. Now, the interesting thing about medicine is that in the last, again, going back to modernity, in the last few centuries, the Western medical model took over in a somewhat violent way from tribal or archaic or folk healing, and there's a gender aspect to it, that a lot of that medicine was really framed in a very male kind of way, and women's healing was suppressed, and many of those witches that were hanged in the 17th century were actually sort of folk healers. And most of the witches that were hanged were women, of course, including in North America, in Salem. So there was a suppression of folk healing, which was associated with, for religious reasons and also for scientific reasons. The two establishments worked very well together on this issue. And then moving forward, one sees how the psychology was medicalized. Freud, for instance, thought that psychoanalysts should be doctors, that he wanted to keep it within the medical profession. There's a whole discussion of a question of lay analysis. It is a big issue. If anybody is not a doctor, should be doing psychoanalysis. And even Milton Erickson, that I have great admiration for, it has been pointed out that he also had a certain inclination to keep things within the medical profession. So, without knocking the medical profession, that of course we could all do with better and more accessible medicine, yes, but medical system. But at the same time, what alternative medicine has been showing is that there is another path. And shamans, I think, gravitate towards healing. It's not necessarily that every shaman is a healer. But for instance, if you look at Hasidism, the founder of the Hasidic movement, Israel Baal Shem Tov, we've got official document in which his profession is listed as doctor. Now, it doesn't mean, yes, and it doesn't mean doctor in the scientific medical Western sense, but it actually means a healer. And he used his powers very largely. A very big part of his reputation, how he built up his reputation, was a healer. And many Hasidic masters were healers. Until today, one can see that. That is, if one observes the Hasidic world, one sees this pattern and how people come to the Rebbes, first of all, for counseling, for what the function of psychologists fulfill in the Western world. And they use trance to some extent, and also for physical healing, which is a more complex issue. But
and is that where you kind of found a correlation with the hypnosis as well?
Yes, that is. I would say that hypnotists, of course, are working in the format of healing, whether in medicine, in dentistry even, or in medicine, and in psychology and psychiatry, like Erickson, and that's certainly a respectable path. But there are, of course, more unofficial forms of healing. And, of course, one of the great innovations of alternative medicine is to realize that there's something called well-being. That is, we can't just compartmentalize and say, okay, there's this or that symptom, and just wait for the symptoms to appear and then start treating them. But there's something, this aspect of well-being, and what has been shown, I think, in many studies is that the regular practice of things like trance, through relaxing the nervous system and so on, has a beneficial effect on general well-being. So I think this is something which is not, one shouldn't relegate it into some kind of esoteric, mystical domain or something of academic interest. I think this is something which is relevant for people's everyday lives in that sense. And there's another thing here which is, if you find it in the Hasidic tradition and you find it in the Buddhist tradition, the idea of a bodhisattva or someone who's dedicated to the welfare of others, is that one of the things about the shamanic path, which is a bit different from other forms of mysticism, is that it's less about going into other worlds and staying there, or just being in contact with God and blissing out on the encounter with the divine. It's more about going back into the world and relating with where people are in their lives and helping them. And I think this is what Hasidic rabbis do. That is, the scholars I grew up with, who would be involved in studying Talmud and so on, some of them in the yeshiva world, some of them would basically, we would hardly say hello to people. It would be like they study and then that's what they do. And the academics like that as well. And I think the shamanic path is different. That is, and in Hasidism one gets a sense as well, is that it's very much about actually going out and helping people. So the
and I think that's a big split. I mean, you see in the monastic traditions, they remove themselves from the community, whereas in Judaism, it's all community-oriented, really. I think that's a really big, important point to make.
Well, it's interesting because we see the split many places. We see it in, as you say, in the East, in Tibet. We've got these monastics that really in a world which is enclosed in some way. It relates to society, but at a distance. And this interesting decision that, again, Dan's teacher was a Buddhist teacher and incarnation of a Lama, and he decided to break out of it, to stop being a monk and to just go out into the world and relate to people. And you find it's true that in the Jewish world there's a strong communal emphasis, a lot of the rites, the rituals are around the meals, around the family and so on. However, these are the yeshiva world, and in a way it's a bit like monasteries of the mind. Is that people, of course, they have families and everything, but a lot of the time is devoted to studying texts, and there's a social aspect to that, but there's a certain remove from the world in that sense. And I think the Hasidic movement, that's what it tried to break out of. And in a way, the Hasidic movement, this message has been lost to some extent, is that many people in the Hasidic world today, they relate only to the Hasidic world, and that's a big loss because they've got something to contribute which is not being given to the world.
Well, that's a couple of wonderful things that come up with that. I mean, one is I felt like your use of because one of the questions your book's asking is like, what do we get out of using this category shamanism and looking at Kabbalah? Like that's something that a lot of people aren't necessarily going to do. Is it valuable? What does it reveal? What does it, how does it work? And for me, one of the most convincing ways that it worked was precisely on the return, on the reintegration, on the social role of the prophet or the visionary that went beyond simply producing texts or even charismatic speech, but actually had direct healing effects, both in terms of literal healing of individuals, but also just a sense that what one is doing in these modes is, in some sense, healing people's worlds. And so your description of how, in order to make this happen, the individual has to kind of break down conventional reality by going into a trance state and experiencing these heights and these depths, that then on the return there's this very noticeable, very, very substantial way in which what gets woven back together is not just that individual's worldview, but this society or collective around it. But you're doing something in a way a little similar, because you're taking Kabbalah out of a strictly Jewish framework. Like you're saying, like one of the things that seems lost in contemporary Hasidism is that it's so insular. And that so is a lot of the discourse around Jewish mysticism and Jewish religion in general. It's like it feels like one of the things that you're actually doing with with the introduction of shamanism as a way of thinking about Kabbalistic experience is to open that stuff out, to break it out even of those categories and show these connections in a really frankly in a very healing way.
Well,
maybe I'm overreading.
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, there's a certain subtext in the book which you've picked up on, in the sense that The first part of it is indeed this whole thing of breaking out of, which is something which I stress quite strongly in the book, and I got some quite polemical about it at some points, I was really sort of hammering it at some points maybe, is to break out of a sort of Judeo-centric bias, which is you can find in scholarship and you can find it in religion and in religious life and in political life. And to say that with all respect to contextualizing things and cultural frameworks, we are speaking about issues which are universal issues, even if interpreted in different ways, and there is room for comparison. And Jewish studies has to get into a much deeper dialogue with other fields, and not just with, which is more common with Western religion, but really to become more interested in Eastern religion and in archaic forms of religiosity in other parts of the globe. And that's certainly a very strong emphasis, I think, in the book and in this whole project. And the other thing is, you mentioned the prophets, which is very interesting because Heschel, who I mentioned before, was a descendant of a Hasidic Rebbe, and he came to the States and really advanced Jewish studies here in the States. And he wrote a book about prophets, and one to say the prophets weren't shamans because he had a certain view of shamanism which reflected the way scholarship about shamanism, where it had reached at his point, at his time. Now, I think that if one looks at the prophets, one sees an interesting thing. One sees definitely something ecstatic going on there. One sees a kind of trance, which is connected to music and other things, but one sees a strong social concern. And this social concern, among some of the prophets at least, becomes universal. If you look at Isaiah, there isn't a sense there of being insular about the Jewish world. There's a sense of a message which is a message for the world, and which the whole world should relate to, and which is part of the healing of the world, and which is connected to a certain vision of nature as well. So I think that this connection between ecstatic experience and social message is something which comes up every now and again.
Well, and it's really interesting with Kabbalah, too, because it is so restricted, you know. I mean, for example, I would always get into trouble with my Hasidic friend because he would say he couldn't tell me things because I was a woman, you know, and a shiksa, too. So, I mean, I was out of luck to get some information out of him. And I would try to discuss, you know, Egyptian themes with him, and he'd say, no, that's hara, you know. So it is interesting that something like a mystic experience that would connect you with everything then becomes insulated in how Kabbalah has I think modern Kabbalah obviously is kind of breaking through a lot of those things, but how do you think Kabbalah became so restricted if it is that kind of like mystic experience? What do you think was kind of behind that?
Well, I would say there's various factors here. It's certainly very true what you say. I often say in my classes at the university, I say, look, if we were speaking in a traditional context, Kabbalistic context, you have to realize that this class would start emptying out because, first of all, as you say, the woman would have to step out, and that's certainly true in the Hasidic world today. And then anybody who's not Jewish, and then anybody who's not observant of the commandments. And slowly the class would start to empty. And even then they would start asking people if they're married or not. So it's usually not the case for students. So at least undergrad. So that's true. There's something very insular about it. And the question, why did this come to be, is a very interesting one. I would say a few things. First of all, one has to remember all the time the context of persecution. That is, the Jewish world, one has to remember, has been operating in an environment of persecution for many, many centuries, and it's hard to let go of. And that creates insularity. But even beyond that, as I was saying, one has to respect also, with all one's emphasis on universality, the cultural context. And I think the great dilemma of our times, how can each tradition be true to itself? How can each tradition be true to its own path, to its own way of looking into the world, its own way of experience? Just like you mentioned, the whole thing of davening, of prayer. So how is one feeling? How can one be true to these practices or other things like the Sabbath, which is basically like a whole day of trance in its ideal form, even though in many communities it's not that anymore. So how does one keep that and at the same time reach out to the world? And I think that usually people are upped into one of two extremes. That is the popular Kabbalah that you mentioned, like Madonna and co. And I use the word co advisedly because it is a business enterprise.
Yeah.
they want to completely denude Kabbalah of all its Jewish roots and say you don't need to know Hebrew, you don't need to, it has nothing to do with the commandments, it's nothing to do with the Talmud, and basically uproot it from its cultural context. The other side of it is the sincerity and saying that it only belongs to the Jewish world, it only belongs to the Orthodox Jewish world, it only belongs to men, it only belongs to Hasidim, it only belongs to a certain kind of Hasidim who wear a certain hat and certain socks. That's as far as it gets in some places. And then you get these books, but basically if you read these books, you get the sense that there's about 50 people in the world who are worthy, and all the rest, as you mentioned, belong to the side of evil. So where do we find the middle path between these two? I think it's a challenge, and I think this challenge is for academia as well, because what I wrote in the book is that what one finds in places, especially outside Israel, but not only, is that on one hand we've got academic studies sometimes become disconnected from the texts, and people don't really acquiring the skills to read these texts. On the other hand, I find many students of mine who do have the skills. They can read the text, they can even read the manuscripts. That's fine. They even learn how to read Yiddish, but they're not interested in anything outside the Jewish world. So I think this, out of this sadness and this dilemma, I think the book I think this is part of a backdrop for the book in a way.
No, it's a wonderful way of framing the issue, because it's almost like we can't do it alone. I mean, you can't have. It's very rare you're going to have a person who's able to be masterly in a scholarly sense in one zone, have some kind of practical investment in the ongoing health of that tradition, be open and able to cross lines and know enough about other traditions to be able to to creatively do that. I mean, that's a huge amount of stuff, and so in some ways it has to be kind of a collective operation. And what's challenging about it is that neither the universal or the extreme particular will do. And it's also very interesting from the perspective of somebody like me who has no specific traditional orientation, is interested in all of it, but does not have it's all one, it's all pointing to the same thing. It's like it's very obvious that that's not the case. It's very obvious that there's a tremendous amount that traditions can give you intellectually as well as experientially, and yet at the same time on a global level. I mean, if mysticism is pointing to anything in terms of the nature of reality or the nature of mind or what connects us on a deep level, that clearly something is happening on the planet in terms of how traditions are confronting one another, how they're moving forward. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what you see or what you hope to see. What would be another turning of this, this dialogue that's not just a kind of bland ecumenical chat?
Well, I think you're right. There's some change happening. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it's been happening for a long time, and it's accelerating. And when I just came a few weeks ago from Israel, we're in the middle of tremendous transition and change, and something which looks like the beginnings of a big social change, and throughout the Middle East, really. And this might be connected to spiritual processes. That's certainly what the New Age would say, and I'll get back to that in a minute. I would say that one has to go beyond, I would call vague ecumenical well-wishing. That is, there is a lot of what's called interfaith dialogue today is really about being nice and and it remains sometimes on a superficial kind of level. I think actually Herschel tried to go beyond that, and he did go beyond that in his interfaith dialogue, but that's not universal. I think that we have to find a way. There's two challenges here. One is, and I think that we do see hope emerging. One is that people, whether they're scholars or people who are practitioners in various traditions, will find this ability to be connected, to be rooted, to be anchored in their own tradition, and also to be able to listen deeply to other traditions. There's a wonderful phrase in the part of the samurai literature. There's a book, Hagakure, which actually became a movie called Ghost Dog. And it says that the more one is in concordance with one's own way, one is more and more capable of listening to all ways. So this paradox of being able to go deeply into one's own tradition and listen to other traditions on a deep level, and not just on the level of saying, okay, let's be nice together to one another, which is also a necessary step, but So this ability, I think, is something which we will find emerging, and I think this is the need of our times. And the other mention you guys do, it's interesting because I see myself as a traditional person in the sense of being connected to the Jewish tradition and to its practice, and this is a world which I grew up in and which I moved away to some extent. In some ways, I am connected to it still very much. And of course, there's a new form of religiosity emerging in the last 20, 30, 40 years, which is people who are not connected to any specific traditions. And yet they're not just staying on the level of a sort of superficial discourse of popular, commercialized mysticism, but really do want to go deeper. And what framework, I mean, I don't find it as my personal challenge, but I think this is an important issue, and I think that, again, I think Jeff Kripal is right on that. The university has something to contribute here. I think the university can help provide a framework for people who are searching in this direction. Now, interesting thing about the university is that, again, there's these two extremes, that either the university becomes something which comes to serve some political or cultural or economic agenda, or it becomes somewhere which is sterilized, where people are not confronted, students come and basically they're told that all the issues which concern them existentially, spiritually, are not relevant here because all we're doing here is studying texts. So I think the university also has to find its place in this dilemma.
Well, I think the university gets to win when individuals just come and hang out with each other and talk to each other. You know, to me, the university works, like you said, only when it breaks out of that sterility. And,
yes.
You know, the biologists start talking to the physicists who start talking to the religion majors, and they all, like, literally will eat lunch together. And to me, that's where those true kind of breakthroughs happen. So that's, like, the one little point of hope, I think, that shines through.
I think so. I think the interdisciplinarity in some ways has got a bad rep because sometimes it tends to be a bit superficial, but I think that it's called for. And one of the exciting things I found when I was writing this book, I had this research team going on at the Hebrew University together with my friend Philip Wexler, and through Philip especially I discovered this possibility of developing a conversation between people who are into psychology and sociology, anthropology, and the humanities. This is another divide which needs to be bridged. That is, there are a lot of people who are doing work on these issues in anthropology, in cultural psychology and social psychology, and once we get a conversation going between people who are working with texts and between people from these disciplines, then it really becomes interesting. I think it's indeed one of the great places about the university is that it's a medium in which, especially today with the internet and so on, one can really develop these close conversations with people around the world. Now, my feeling is that the university, to some extent, is part of this global community, and in Israel there's some resistance to that in some circles. However, the university is by default part of this global community. And at the same time, I think the university also has to relate to its own local communities. So one of the issues which is coming up in Israel is that the university has to relate to society, but we're part of a society, we need to be part of healing this society. So that's one of the issues which has come up the last few weeks.
Well, Jonathan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're going to have to wrap it up here, and I just wanted to have time to let people know that they should, please check out Shamanic Trance and Modern Kabbalah. It's a fascinating book and a fascinating way of looking into how these sort of intertraditional dialogues could happen. And I also wanted to point out to people that they could go to your page on academia.edu and can get some of your essays there, although unfortunately your essay on Tolkien seems to be in Hebrew. So I'm not that intertraditional, unfortunately. But anyway, Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us on Expanding Mind.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to both of you, and thank you again. Thank you for your kind words about the book as well.
Okay, wonderful.
So great to talk to you.
From me and Matja, keep your minds open.
You're listening to the #1 Internet radio